Hey guys, just a bit of an update for you on some goings on here. We've had some anti-immigration protests and we've had some pro-immigration protests and we've had some discussion about compulsory Japanese testing for anybody wanting different types of visa for Japan. And what was the other one? One more, there was one more. Oh, yes, the other one was the Japanese government's been talking about recording or keeping track of the nationalities of foreigners buying land in Japan. So I actually might start with that one because I've got to admit I was actually surprised myself. Those of you who have been with us a while would have followed the progress as we looked for a house and bought a house, and I was actually quite surprised at the time that there is currently no system in Japan that differentiates between a foreigner buying land in Japan and a Japanese person. So basically, until now, anybody that had the money could buy property in Japan, still can. The only complications might be with things like you'd have to have the money, you'd have to have the cash, because if you weren't stable in Japan, obviously you'd have trouble getting a bank loan, and there's all sorts of small complications like that. You need to have a registered hanko, the inkan, the seal thing. But there was no requirement as far as residential status or visa status or anything like that, which meant that there was a few hoops to jump through. But if you had the money, you could buy land in Japan, still can. So I was actually a bit surprised by that at the time. So the new Japanese government's been talking about making a rule that cities have to keep track of the nationality of anybody buying property. So, again, a lot of this discussion has sort of, you get both sides of these debates that tend to be a bit extreme. But what the government themselves have actually been saying seems to be quite reasonable. That doesn't seem to be an unreasonable thing, just to keep track of the nationality of people buying land in Japan. It seems pretty reasonable. I mean, it's their country. They could ban foreigners from buying land in Japan if they wanted to. And they're not talking about anything nearly that extreme. All they want to do is keep track of the nationality of the people that are buying it. So, that seems fairly reasonable. Depending on your perspective, of course, there's both sides of every argument, and we tend to fall about in the middle of most discussions, which means we tend to be attacked by both sides. So usually the conservative thinkers tend to not like what we say, and the radical thinkers tend to not like what we say. So that's what you get for being relatively moderate when it comes to most topics. But the other point is, of course, that we just have to accept whatever the Japanese government says. There's no point in getting emotional about it. We just have to accept what they say. So if they want to record the nationality of people buying land in Japan, that's their prerogative. Our thinking is that we just got to go along with it. No point in getting upset about it. Speaking of which, the next one is they've been talking about making the JLPT, the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, a requirement for certain visas, right? Which that could upset some people, that you have to be able to pass a Japanese proficiency test. Not quite sure what yet. They're talking about bringing it in 2026 or 2027, and there's been different talks as to what it would apply to. I've seen some reports that they want to apply that to permanent residency. I've heard other reports that said that it wasn't going to apply to permanent residency. I suspect it would. And then certain other visas too, it said. So as we get more confirmed details that aren't just rumours, we'll update you guys on that. But again, it's their country. If they choose to have these requirements, it's up to them. Having said that, I suspect there'd be a lot of cases where the Japanese employers of various people would find that extremely inconvenient. So the first example that comes to mind is obviously the English companies. There's companies that employ foreigners to come here on a 1-year instructor's visa to teach English for a year. Quite often they provide them with accommodation and basically set everything up for them, and then most of those English schools have a rule that the teachers aren't allowed to speak Japanese in the class, right? There's this thing that they have that, you know, it's sort of the idea seems to be some sort of English immersion thing where the students can only speak English, the teachers aren't allowed to speak Japanese in the class, right? Which means, really, for those people that do that come here for a year to do that, stay in an apartment that's provided by the English school, work in a place, in a work environment where only English is allowed to be spoken, you know, those guys really don't need Japanese proficiency, do they? You know, and in fact, if the government start demanding that they pass Japanese proficiency tests, that's probably going to make it much harder for those Japanese companies to get instructors, because there'll be a lot of people that either can't pass the test or don't want to do all the study and everything required, and will just go and teach English in Korea or China or somewhere else because it'll be easier, you know. So it's probably not doing Japanese companies a favour, that rule. The other one that comes to mind is there are a lot of companies now in Japan, or there are companies in Japan now, for example Mitsubishi and Rakuten and ANA and a few others, that actually have English proficiency as a prerequisite for employment by all their staff, including the Japanese staff, right? And a couple of them, maybe Mitsubishi was one, there's a couple of them that have made, might be Rakuten as well, have made the official language for the company English, right? Because these big companies have recognised that if they want to do business internationally, that they need to make it uniformly English across the board, and so they'll make it a policy that everybody speaks English in their company. Which means if they want to employ an American engineer or a German engineer or somebody else to come work here for them, because they need that person's expertise, which falls within the government's talking about changing the visa laws again, the visa requirements again, so that people coming have to have some skill that's useful to Japan. So if a company like Mitsubishi decides that they need the skills that some German engineer has or an American engineer, they need that person and they want the person to come here, but they tell the person, oh, by the way, sorry, we can't employ you until you have a JLPT 5 level or a JLPT 4 level or something. Well, they might just not get that employee, huh? And in fairness, that employee doesn't really need to be able to speak Japanese or write Japanese to come here, right? So it's probably, it's their right to do it if they want to do it, but it's probably not going to be doing them any favours. I think there's this underlying tone at the moment that a lot of Japanese people don't really want more foreigners coming here anyway. So if they lift the bar to a point where a lot of foreign people can't come here anymore, then they don't sort of mind. But there will be cases like those ones I just mentioned where I could just see it being a problem for the Japanese companies, the ones that need, some foreign skills, some people with some foreign people with skills to come here for different reasons, and they just can't get them here because they can't pass a Japanese test. You can see that being a problem, couldn't you? So, and yes, there have been. What happens? I think what the Japanese government's actually been saying, what this new Prime Minister and her ministers have actually been saying, when you look at it, what they actually say, look at the actual quotes of what they say and listen to what they say, what they're saying isn't too extreme, but what's happening is, because when you start talking about this topic, it opens a can of worms, doesn't it? We've seen this in other countries too, haven't we? Once you start talking about foreigners in your country, then it opens up the whole can of worms, and you end up with the extreme xenophobes at one end of the spectrum. And we've seen protests around Japan, anti-immigration protests, calling for stronger immigration laws, and we don't want foreigners here, and that it sets those guys off when you talk about the foreigners. Those guys get triggered and off they go. And then we've actually seen pro-immigration protests as well, where people have been having big protests, and Japanese people with signs saying, treat everybody fairly and equality for all, and all sorts of really good stuff like that. So it's definitely set off both sides of the argument, as these sorts of discussions generally do, So I got to admit, as a foreigner living in Japan, I wish it had just all settled down and disappeared. But obviously, as predicted in previous videos on this topic, this won't be the end of it. You know, we're going to hear more and more of it. So there's going to be a lot of debate, obviously, about those immigration rules and the visas and so on. And the other one they mentioned too in regards to that too was lifting the requirement for citizenship, as well as the Japanese requirement, lifting it to 10 years. Might have been permanent residency too, because obviously when you get these discussions, you get a lot of the suggestions can be quite extreme as well, you know. And I think they were talking about lifting the requirement because at the moment, if you can tick a few of the boxes that they've got as far as what you're doing here, some people have been able to get permanent residency pretty quickly, you know, within a couple of years. So I think some ministers are campaigning to lift that to like 10 years. You know, be here for 10 years and be behaving yourself and paying your tax. They keep talking about that all the time. People who are not paying their taxes, they're really jumping on that. And people with unpaid medical bills, that was another one, that people with unpaid medical bills for as little as $100, as little as Ichiman yen with 10,000 yen, which is $100. If you have an unpaid medical bill, that you might not be allowed to renew your visa, or if you've left the country and you want to come back in again, so someone like yourself on a permanent residency, if you leave the country and you try and come back in again, if you've got an unpaid medical bill, you might be refused entry. Right? And again, it's their right, isn't it? You know, if you come here and you don't pay your taxes and you don't pay your medical bills, because that's what they're on about when they talk about, sometimes they just put this under the broad category of social obligations. And when they say that, they're talking about people paying their taxes, paying their pension, which is compulsory. We're supposed to pay into our pension, and pay our health insurance. And what's been happening is a lot of foreign people come here and don't do those things, and don't pay their health insurance, and then they go to a hospital or go to the doctor and run up a medical bill, and because they're not covered by the insurance, medical insurance, if they don't pay the bill remains unpaid. And so a lot of Japanese people are really annoyed with that, which is fair enough again. I mean, it's not being a good guest at all, is it? To come and stay in another country and not pay your bills. You know, that's bad behaviour. I've been seeing bad behaviour like that from foreigners for a couple of decades. I've seen people in the past brag about it on social media. Oh yeah, I stayed in an apartment there, and when it came time to leave, I just packed up my bag and left all my rubbish there and just left, and sort of brag about how I didn't do any of that stuff. I didn't pay the health insurance, and I wasn't going to pay any of that. I'm not Japanese. I didn't do any of that. So I just packed up my bag when it came time to go home. I just packed up my bag and left my apartment a mess, and just off I went, bragging about it on social media. You know, this is what I did. You know, so there's been foreigners. Well, is it Samurai William? One of the books that talked about the first foreigners to come here like 500 years ago, and the Japanese greeted them really friendly and showed them around. And there's a story of them taking them to this big Buddha statue, and it had a hole at the back, like so you get inside. And I've seen big Buddhas that have that for some reason. I don't know why they have that, but it'll be open at the back so you can go inside. And the foreigner went in there and carved, this is a true story, went in there and carved his name on the inside of the Buddha statue, right? Which, you know, one of the first foreigners to come to Japan, and he did that, right? So any wonder we got banned for 300 years. So I can see both sides of the coin. You know, we got to fulfill our social obligations. But the discussion, what the Prime Minister and her ministers have been saying hasn't been too bad. But the discussion can make you uncomfortable. Makes me uncomfortable. You know, the extremists watching the anti-foreigner protests and hearing the extreme comments, you know, from people. And it does tend to make you, as I mentioned in a previous video, you know, another foreign guy and I were talking about this here recently, and it could just be in our imaginations of now we've become self-conscious about it, but but it does feel like some people are looking at us more intensely than usual. That may or may not be true. That might be our own perceptions based on our own discomfort at this current situation, you know, but that's definitely how we both feel, as if at the moment we do feel as if we're getting the hairy eyeball from more people than usual. I mean, you always get that in Japan. There's occasionally a person that just stares with a fairly unfriendly face, and you do get that now and again, people that don't seem very welcoming, but it does seem like it's more common at the moment, because obviously we've opened that can of worms. Now we can express our opinions on the foreigners, right? What we think about the foreigners. I don't like the foreigners, I wish they'd all go home. It's sort of okay to say that now because we're talking about that now, whereas previously wasn't sort of such a common conversation, and people wouldn't have felt so comfortable being so blunt. The good old days. The good old days. Anyway, this won't be the last time we talk about this topic, so I'll keep you updated as we get more information. You get a lot of conflicting stuff, a lot of conflicting reports, because a lot of the proposals get reported like fact, and again, the clickbaiters and the attention seekers jump on this stuff, right? And so the way they report these things is, this is what's happening, and in actual fact that everything I've just said to you is proposed, right? Those laws haven't been passed yet. But what the clickbaiters and the attention seekers tend to report on is the most dramatic stuff that's suggested, which may or may not actually come to happen, you know. So don't panic. Anybody who's thinking about coming to Japan, don't panic yet. None of this stuff's happened yet. So, you know, as stuff becomes more concrete, we'll fill you in as we know what's going on. That's all we can do. We're just purely observers when it comes to this stuff. But what we can do, and as I've been saying for the last 15 years we've been posting YouTube videos, what we can do is we can act as ambassadors for non-Japanese people and behave ourselves and be polite and nice to people and behave ourselves, because that experience that Japanese people have of us is going to be a big influencer on how they perceive foreigners, you know. And as I've said before, I've met lots of people here who've never spoken face to face with a foreigner before, and so if you're the first foreigner they ever speak face to face to, and you behave yourself and you're polite and you're nice, it'll have a positive effect, obviously. But if you're a rude, arrogant, vlogging fool, then it won't have a positive effect, will it? So that's what we can do. So with all these things, I always think, what can we do? You know, two smart things in Japanese thinking. Sorry guys, and in Japanese language, two smart things. One is gembare, which is do your best, and the other one is shogunai, which is it can't be helped, sort of thing. And it's really good thinking, because if you have those two things, everything's either one or the other, isn't it? So as for the Japanese laws, what they do with their laws and their Japanese requirements, and you know, any other rules that they're going to bring in the future that are going to affect us, we can't do anything about that, can we? You know, so that's a shogunai situation, because we can't do anything about it. And then the stuff that we can do something about, like, you know, how we behave ourselves, obviously, you know, we should gembare, we should do our best and behave ourselves as best we can, you know. So anyway, that's more than enough of that. No doubt it won't be the last time we talk about this. It'll be going on for a few years by the look of it, at least. At least. More videos coming soon.